So going to take these two forms that have been handmade by an artist here working at the studio, and we're going to make press molds. These are just solid pieces of clay, since we're going to make a mold of this, and the shape can be recreated to form bowls or vessels of these two different sizes. So we're going to prepare these for making a one-part mold, and then go through the process and pour plaster and everything. So the first thing to do is to assess the shape and the draft for the shape, the draft that will be necessary for the plaster. One way to look at it is for the plaster to be able to lift directly up off of the original piece. There can be no undercuts. So here, where it's going underneath a little bit, we need to take some clay and fill in those areas so that there's proper draft for the piece. The draft comes into play with the function of the mold, because when you have a plaster mold turned upside down and you press the clay slab into there, you need the clay to be able to lift directly out, and anywhere where the plaster would have those undercuts would stop the clay from lifting out of there. So the idea of draft is really important for mold making, and it's one of the more difficult concepts to grasp the very first time you start to think about it and work on these processes, but it comes easier and easier as you go with it. So we want these pieces to have the handmade look to them, so I don't want to try to smooth it out completely and make it perfectly smooth anywhere. So what I'm going to do is just look right around the bottom here and start to add a little bit of clay. It looks like the biggest issue right here is going to be where it's coming under. The other thing I'll do is put a straight edge on the side so that I can see if there's any undercuts in between this area from here to here, which there will be some, I'm sure. The other thing I want to do as I start to prep these is I'm prepping them very purposefully on this board. This is a piece of melamine, so it is a non-porous board that I can pour plaster onto, and it'll release really easily. So I want to make sure that I get these in place, and I'll probably use the same board for both. Phone crisis averted. So back to this. Gonna do both of these forms. I think I can get away with doing on the same board, but I need to make sure that I have enough space all the way around there to pour the plaster and have about a 1 inch thick, 1/2 to 1 inch thick wall. So I'm going to use the two pieces on the board, catty corner like this, and just using a different color clay here because it's what I grabbed. These are just a kind of stoneware clay. So we'll get started down in the very corner. Rolling a coil and putting it in place now. And again, trying to mimic the surface that I'm working with. And in this case, it's got some pinch marks and some things in there that we want to keep. So I'm looking at this from above on this side and trying to make sure that I get a nice clean line. Let's see if I can do this. What I was just referring to is I was using my finger to straighten this line here and make this a very clean attachment where I lose any shadows that are happening there because of the undercuts that were there. And when you look from above like this, if the clay moves out, if you have too much of a skirt out on the bottom, that's going to be reflected right at the very edge where your plaster and your piece of clay are going to meet. So this edge right here ends up being really important in the function of the mold, so you want to make sure it's nice and clean. So we're going to do that all the way around now. Just smishing this coil into the corner and then using my finger to clean up that edge. so now that I've gotten the bottom filled in, going around again, and just getting rid of any place that I see a cave. If you look at this as the side of a mountain, anywhere there's a cave, anywhere there's a little divot in, that's a potential keyhole or undercut that will not help us when we're using this mold. Okay, so I'm going to go grab a ruler. Okay, with the ruler now, what we want to do is use this on the side, and this will give us an idea of where we're going to have issues with plaster getting stuck in there. So if I put this from here to here, you can see this divot that's in the clay from the shape of the wall. And so what we need to do now is we're going to change the shape of our master piece here so that it is a successful mold. And so sometimes you do have to think about the aesthetics of your piece changing a little bit. This side is much better. Change the camera angle so you can see that a little better. So this side, when I put the ruler down at the very bottom, it's looking okay. So over there is one thing. Over here, when we put the ruler on there, you have the noticeable gap. So that's what we're going to work with. In this case, I'm going to take down some on the top, and so I'll grab a tool to do that. So I got a rasp and a wood tool. Let's see which works best. I know the rasp will be able to take the clay away, but the rasp adds the texture to the piece where this is a smooth piece. So I'm going to try the wood tool first and just use this to scrape the clay a little bit. If I do it this way, maybe you can see. So I'm going to scrape. You can see again the gap there in the middle, and then what I'm going to do, instead of removing any down here, I'm going to remove this this edge. And anyone that works with clay knows you need to take your time, and I can scrape this in such a way it looks like the clay is still a good leather hard consistency, soft enough for me to remove this clay on the top corner, which will be the interior corner of the bowl when it's all said and done. So it shouldn't affect the shape too much, especially if I mimic the pinched look. A lot of sculpting clay is done with a technique like this of scraping away and then smoothing. Some people, when they're in the beginning, they rely on smoothing a little too much, and when you smooth clay you push it somewhere else. But in this case, if I remove the clay, I can shape it more purposefully and then smooth the surface to give it the look on the surface that we want. Okay, so now if I put the tool on here, there is a gap still here to here, but the fact that on the where this top part is and it turns over, this is not sticking out and having it's not a high area with a low area above it. So the low area is right in the middle, and again, you have to imagine the way that a piece of plaster will pull up off of this once this is surrounded by plaster. And as long as we don't have any jutting out areas in the middle there, we should be good. So I'll go around and check the rest of this. Scrape off. I didn't really scrape off this backside, is what you can't see is the one that is fine. So we're basically making the rest of the mold shape, I'm missing the word, the rest of the form to match this backside that's working just fine. So there, now that I've removed some of that with the wood tool, scraped it, now I'll use my hand and smooth it over and just get it to be overall a matching look on the surface as far as the slight undulations that are happening. There's a corner here, but it's a pretty soft corner. And so this particular form is fairly flat on the top. This could be convex or concave, as long as there's no, it can be dug in concave as long as there's no undercuts there that would stop the plaster from pulling off. So the top is another thing to consider. And so this shape is looking good, so we'll go on to the next one. While I work on the next one, I'm actually going to cover this one in some plastic just to keep it from drying out. Okay, so this piece here, so this one we have more issues with the undercuts than the last one. Another way to put that is we're dealing with the same issue where it cuts under, but in this particular case it starts to cut under very high up in the design. And so I talked with the artist that worked on this already and mentioned what I'm going to have to do here, which is going to change the shape fairly drastically. So when she was imagining this coming out of the bowl and having this curved shape, when it comes out of the mold, in fact, what's going to happen is it's going to be more straight up and down on the edges. And so as this is used as a press mold going forward, each piece will need to be altered from walls that are going straight up and down. You press it into the mold, and then you would cut darts out of the clay and reform the shape. So this is an instance where the finished idea is not quite what can be achieved by a simple one-part mold, and rather get into a more difficult process of molding. We're going to take a little bit of time and set it up for one part. Because of the nature of the work that's coming out of this, these molds are meant to be part of a fairly involved sculpting process, assembling and sculpting process to make figurative, sculptural, sometimes functional pieces. But so these molds, we have a lot of leeway, and in fact are going for some of that pinched look. So there's a start, and using the stick, we can assess where the undercuts are, and there, and here we need to still fill in this entire area. So get some more clay. Rolling coil-ish things, and then just kind of smush it on there. And it's really helpful to gauge draft by looking directly down from above. So when we look like this, this area right here, when I'm looking down, if I can see, geez, this is a failed attempt at a camera change. If I do this and I'm looking down from the top, if I can see this clay that I'm adding going out, as opposed to see just a drop off, like if you were looking down the side of a cliff. So looking from above, you can get the idea of draft pretty easily. This is that shadow there that I'm filling, so some of the last ones on this side. So the idea of this video is to give you an idea about one-part press molds. So you are going to have to use your imagination at first to think about what you're going to make your mold of, what form you're going to make it of, and if you're going to use it in part of a larger sculptural process like this, or if you're going to make a mold of something that, if you're making a mold of something that's going to be a finished piece or close to right when it comes out of the mold. You're not going to have as much leeway probably as I have here to just smush some clay on and change things up a little bit. So this initial prep work changes piece by piece, and sometimes you don't have to do any of this if you've already made your form with draft in mind. And just like any process, there's a learning curve to it, and once you go through the process a couple times, it becomes easier and easier to see where the issues are. So I'm going to go around looking at this thing from the side and doing that last step of looking for any undercuts in the middle section. Looking down from above, there's no undercut down towards the bottom. Okay, so this looks ready to go. I might fuss with it a little bit more to make the surface of the clay that I just added to it match better the surface of the clay that's existing. And if I needed to, I could scrape some away and do that, but it actually looks pretty good. Ready to go. So we'll cover these with plastic, and the next thing we'll do is build retaining walls around them out of clay so that we can pour plaster into the inside. Next up in the process for making these molds is to figure out to build the retaining walls around the pieces so that we can pour the plaster in, and to figure out also how much plaster we'll need. So I'm going to go ahead and figure out the plaster first, and then I'll go into building the walls. So for figuring out the amount of plaster needed, you need a couple tools, a ruler, paper and a pencil, and also a spreadsheet on your computer that's very helpful. Called the Gypsum Plaster Mix Guide. And what you'll do is measure the pieces that you're working with and estimate the size of the plaster mold that you're going to make, and you can figure out exactly how much plaster you're going to need to have a 1-inch shell poured around this thing. So the way to look at it is with the smaller one first. We're going to make a wall that's 1 inch away from the current diameter that we have here. And then we're going to make the walls continue 1 inch above this. So when we pour the plaster in there, it will be covering all sides. And if you think about that shape solid, you can get that mass. And then if you make the measurement of this shape solid, you get this mass, and you subtract the two. So doing that, and I measure up the side. This comes to 3.75 inches up, and then going left to right for the diameter. It's about 4 inches on the top, and it tapers down a little bit. So I said 4.25 inches diameter and 3.7 inches high, and put that into the gypsum numbers spreadsheet, and we get 0.03 cubic feet. So I mark that down on a piece of paper, and then do the same thing for now the plaster. The shape of the plaster is going to be an inch wider on each side. So if this is 4.25, then we need 6.25 inches for the plaster, and we add an inch to the top. So when we put that into the spreadsheet, we get 0.08 cubic feet. So now what we need to do is subtract the mass on the inside from the solid mass on the outside to get just the shell. So you subtract 0.03 from 0.08, and you get 0.05 cubic feet. So that's for this one. Since we're going to pour both at the same time, I went and did the same measurements for this, diameter and height, put that in there, and 6-inch diameter by 3.5 inches tall. It's 0.06. The mold size is going to be 0.13, so we subtract 0.06 from 0.13, and you get 0.07. So you add these two numbers together, 0.07, 0.05, 0.12, and that's the 0.12 cubic feet is what we're going to need for both of these molds. So then we take this information and go back to the spreadsheet, put in the 0.12, and then it calculates for us based on the density of our plaster, which is given to us by the company, that number 70, and then it gives you the exact amount of water and plaster that you need to mix. Using some red clay to make some quick slabs. The clay that you use for the walls of your mold should be whatever is most readily available for you, and you don't mind throwing away at the end of it, because you'll get little chunks of plaster in the clay, and that doesn't work out so well if you have that mix into your working clay. So you want to use the cheapest clay you have. If you're going to make molds in your studio, you can reuse the clay for other molds, so you don't have to throw it away necessarily. You can't really safely use it to make clay artwork after this. So these slabs can be pretty quick and dirty. Just want to keep them a little bit on the thick side so they have some strength to hold the liquid plaster in place. Okay, so we have some slabs rolled out here, and we're ready to start building the walls. The one thing I want to do to the slab is cut a straight edge to put on the bottom. I'm pretty quick and dirty with this stuff, so I'm just going to put this here, use my wood tool, and cut that off. Just cut off the ends. And let's see, they're about the same height. Let's use this one. And I'm just going to, looking down from the top here, I'm going to go about an inch away from the edge. And this non-porous melamine board is allowing the clay to stick on there pretty well. I want to have enough space where I can get my hand inside here and put a little coil of clay to make sure. Take this scrap, quick coil. The interior corner is pretty important to make sure it's sealed very well, because plaster in its liquid form, just like water, finds a way out through the tiniest little weakness plaster does the same thing, and if you have wet plaster come out of your mold while you're pouring it, it's a bummer because it goes everywhere. It's a big mess. So this is another portion of the mold making process that you want to take your time on. Make sure that you get your walls with a thick enough slab, and you can reinforce clay anywhere it starts to get a little bit thin. You could just kind of put clay on the outside like this and build buttresses on the outside. So you're going to help yourself by smearing that connection together on the interior corner and the exterior. This one I'm going to cut the top as well, just to make it a little more even. And on the edge, actually, what I need to see here now is how tall. So this needs to be raised up a little bit. This needs to be raised up even a little bit more. It's 5 1/4. So I can measure this and see that this is the one that I was at 3.75. So I know I want my wall to be 4 and 0.75, 4 3/4, but it doesn't need to be exact. So I'll go ahead and measure this wall, so when I put this one up, this is the correct height. And where they come together on the edge, I'm going to overlap that slightly. I'm not really worrying about scoring because this doesn't need to get through drying and firing. Needs to be strong enough to hold the plaster. And again, judging from the inside looking down, make sure that I'm getting the 1 inch spacing on the inside. Overlap together and smoothing that together. You can use some of these scraps to extend this portion of the wall. If you want your mold to be about 1 inch thicker than your piece, if you want your mold at 3.75 inches, you can make the wall a little bit taller. And it would be even fine if this wall tapers in a little bit. What you're establishing here, if the interior of the shape is how the outside of your plaster form is going to look. And because this has a little bit of taper to the inside shape, it kind of makes sense to taper that in, and that would save me a little bit of plaster. If I have this going out this direction, it's going to have a little extra plaster at the top that's not really needed. Just sort of saving the material a little bit. Change the camera angle so you can see from the inside down what it's looking like. And so I have the coil smooth on this side and not yet done on this side there. I'll turn it around. Right in there I need to fill in a little bit more clay, and then we'll be set. In there, and making sure this feels well attached. coil on the inside. Now I'm going to go around and fuss with this a little bit, just make sure that looking strong enough at the bottom there. Little part where it comes together here, this looks a little thin right where my finger is there. So I'm going to take a little dollop of clay, happen to put in this one on the inside. I'm just going to smear that together to thicken the wall there. So make sure you're taking a look at it and assess where there might be any weak areas in the clay because it's a little bit thinner. That's looking pretty good. So looking down from the top, you can still see some of the white melamine. That's the space around there. If you look at it from the side, the pieces below the wall enough to put this across here and just get a sense by bringing that down. That's the thickness, plenty thick on the top there. So we'll do the next one. This one I've got a pretty decent slab to start with here. I'll go do my height. Remind myself 3.75, just like the last one. So I'm going to cut straight to establish one side. And I'll do 4 3/4, which is right at that point there. That's 4. So we're just going to cut off this bit and get the end straight. So here's the wall. So with this particular mold setup, I'm doing 2 next to each other. I'm going to use this existing wall as the space in between there, because that's just about 1 inch right there. So I'm going to take this wall and attach it to this. Since I'm pressing against this part of the clay, I'm going to put my hand on the inside so that I don't deform the shape of the mold too much when I'm doing this. Okay, so that's smeared together well enough. Pick this up, continue this around, and bring it to right there. So look from the top, that is going to work just fine. So now smear together the inside of this mold and work on that bottom edge right where it attaches. A little bit of coil in here just for some extra strength. Don't really need to smooth it together. Just make sure that it's attached well enough to hold for a few hours while it's got moisture in it. Okay, so now I'll roll a few coils to put on the interior. If I roll them pretty thin first, then it makes my life a little easier. Get it in here. And pushing that coil right into the bottom corner. And then smoothing it side to side, which will give me my final shape for the piece.
Can I spray something?
No, she's using it.
When was you doing spray?
Not for a while.
It's going to be done much sooner than I thought.
Alright, so that coil is pretty well smoothed together. Might be able to spend a little more time on it. Inside of the mold. A little bit of cleaning up. So what we need to do next is weigh our plaster, get it ready to mix, and we'll spray mold release on the inside of this, so when we pour it, the plaster easily releases. So we're going to take a moment away from these, and this is wet clay. I'm going to go ahead and cover this. The water-based clay will dry out pretty quick open air, so you want to make sure you cover your pieces and then going step to step. And before we do the plaster mixing, just do a little cleanup. Just going to wipe this red clay off the tabletop so that I've got a nice clean area to work. I don't always take this much time in between steps of the process to clean, but with mold making, I find it beneficial because you want to take your time and do step by step and make sure that you've got everything set up. So when you pour it, everything's ready to go. And for me, sometimes it's cleaning times. Mental checklist and just make sure that I'm getting everything right. So referencing the sheet again, for the 0.12 cubic foot of plaster, we need 8.4 pounds of plaster and 5.9 pounds of water. Okay, so we will measure the water first. Start up the scale, change the mode to pounds. Set this on there. We're going to weigh the bucket, and we're going to tear the bucket. Okay, so now we're set up 5.9 pounds of water. The soap that I'm using is from a local distributor, Clovis Clay Company, and this is a fairly thick kind of soap that needs to be diluted in water. So I'm just putting some of that into the water, and then I'll use a paintbrush, mix it up. So this particular mold soap is water soluble, and you just get it to the consistency you want. Put some water in there because my bottle is drying out a little bit altogether, so make sure that's on there. Alright. Okay, now I've got a sudsy consistency. I just want to paint those suds on here. Show you what I'm doing. On the top, mold. Just going to go all the way around and paint the melamine on the bottom. Try to get it on the sides. In this case, with leather hard clay, can be peeled out of plaster, so if it's stuck a little bit, I can just peel the clay away. So the mold soap is helpful but not absolutely necessary. There's other materials that you may have made your, if you're using a found object to make a mold out of it, or if you're using plaster as your original piece, then you really want to make sure your plaster sticks to plaster. Plaster sticks to non-porous, kind of suctions itself, so sometimes it's hard to get off. So I was going to put a mold release in there. If you're in a pinch, WD-40 can be sprayed in. A really good mold soap is a mixture of Murphy's Oil Soap, which is available at any hardware store pretty much, and water. And look up the ratio for that. I would start at 50-50. Actually, I would start at Google
So if you Google mold making, you'll find all sorts of helpful things, websites that have posted about it, and all sorts of things, because there's all these ratios that you need to remember and steps to the process. So, okay, so these little suds, we're going to smooth those out as it dries. If you still see some of those bubbles, you might as well smooth them out. Just use my hand. This is helping disperse the oil around a little bit. Okay. So now we're ready to pour and mix the plaster. I've got my water in one bucket and my dry plaster in the other, and I use the spreadsheet from the company so I know exactly how much plaster I need, and that is something I highly recommend, is that you do the legwork up front to figure out your volume, figure out your weight of water and plaster, and now what I do to mix is solely based on timing, and there's no feel or understanding when the plaster has saturated the water enough. No guessing games helps. So I've got my phone out here so that I can use a timer. I'm going to bring up my stopwatch timer and set the timer to 2 minutes. And the reason for this is I want to pour the plaster into the water and let it sit for 2 minutes. And then I want to mix it for 2 minutes, and then I want to pour it. Again, no guessing games on this. That is from the company that makes the plaster. There's even a way when you mix it that you want the mixer in an angle and hold it in the same place. I'm using a paddle mixer on a drill. I have 2 sizes of this. This is my smaller size, and it correlates basically with how much liquid is in the bucket. So the liquid in the bucket just fills up past the head of this mixer. Bigger or smaller, I would choose my mixer side. You can also mix with your hand if you mix well enough. Just continue to mix for 2 minutes straight. You want to try to avoid getting too many air bubbles in the plaster as you mix. But I found that timing ends up being the key component. 2 minutes is a long time when you're doing the hand mixing, but if you wait for it to start to thicken, that ends up being like 4 or 5 minutes, so it's going to be very liquid when you go to do it. So again, put my whisk in. Put the plaster now. Get it whisk in. And just add this into the. So as I pour the plaster into the water, I'm going to use my hand to help sift it around and evenly distribute it. And I'm going to do this fairly quickly without having the plaster fall into the bucket in the big floor. Using my fingers to move it around. There's the end of it. So something right there hits the timer. 2 minutes started. And watch this settle. So the plaster is still disintegrating into the water. Just a little bit. Just kind of shake it down. And this is, sometimes you'll hear people describe pouring the plaster in until there are islands in the bucket. Now that the cloud of dust has dispersed, I can take my mask off. So people will put this in here until there's the islands are forming, but it's just not at all exact that way. So going by weight is much better. Got a minute left, so we're just going to let it sit here for a minute. And actually, what I'm going to do in that minute is get a bucket of cleaning water ready. nice clean bucket of water to quickly put my mixer into, so that cleaning plaster, you can either wait until it completely hardens and crack it off, or you can clean it right away and really dilute it with a bunch of water. So, 3 seconds left on the timer. So there it goes. I'm going to go ahead and set it again for 2 minutes right away, and then I'm going to start mixing it. So I'm just going to put the drill in here, mix. Let's see if I can. Power first. I'm missing my mixing time here. Control it with 2 hands instead of holding the computer. And while I'm mixing, I'm holding the drill. Sometimes it goes too fast and I get more air mixing up than I want to. With the liquid level this low and the mixer not being totally submerged, it's more likely to get air bubbles in it this way. Mixing my timer here. I got 30 seconds left. So again, 2 minutes while you're mixing seems like a long time. Seems like it's already mixed enough, but they say 2 minutes, so I do 2 minutes. There's a lot of air in there. Okay, slow it down. My drill goes really fast, really quickly. Timer. Okay, so this drill goes directly into the bucket of water there, so that the plaster off the mixer. Now we'll pour the plaster in. A little extra. Pour this nice and even and slow. Try not to have too many air bubbles form. Pouring directly on top of the form in the middle so that the plaster evenly disperses all the way around. Get this one filled up. Right there. I'll go to this one. It's a little accidental piece of clay. Get that off. This one, same thing, trying to pour nice and even and steady. Seeing no lumps in the plaster, which is good. Load up. And I'm actually going to use every last drop of plaster here. So I don't have as much thickness on the top as I'd like there. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up some emergency plaster and top that off. If you pour plaster right on top of the plaster, for this one that's too thin, it will blend together and it's not going to affect the use of the mold because I have at least covered the surface, so I'm going to be able to pour another ½ inch of plaster on the bottom of that to fix that problem. Got some more plaster in the bucket to finish the mold off. I have to go through the timing again. So set the timer. It's already down past a minute, so the first minute 2 minutes of sifting, sitting and sifting, and then 2 minutes of mixing. When I use my hands like this, I'm taking the clumps of plaster. Since I did this plaster in a hurry, I'm mixing a little bit before the 2 minutes is up, and getting the plaster chunks done. So now it's pretty liquidy, and my timer is about to go off. So I'll go ahead and set it again, and I'm just going to do 1 minute. To rush it a little bit, it'll be okay. Now we're getting down to the last few seconds of the anticipation, the waiting. Okay. Okay. Should be good to pour over top, so I was able to mix that in plenty of time. The plaster is still liquid enough that it's going to mix right together. And since I have it, I may as well pour it to the tippy top. Fill that up. Okay, so now I have some excess plaster in the bottom of the bucket. I'm just going to leave that to solidify, and I actually have about a 1/2 inch, so I might get a round bat out of the bottom of the bucket. So a little bit of function you can get out of some of that excess. A little bit of a spillover happening right here. So I'll just be gently with it and move it around too much. What I can do, it's good to have your clay close by, because this wall is holding in a lot of liquid, so I want to be careful with this and not press in. I don't want to cause the issue trying to repair something, but I'm going to add a little extra clay on the outside here, and I'm gently smoothing this together. And just go all the way around, so that will help reinforce. What I want to do now is get some of the air bubbles out. So use a hammer underneath the table. Getting a lot of solid wood tables, hitting the bottom of the table, and trying to vibrate with this little bit. Air bubbles in the plaster aren't such a big deal. Inside the plaster, they're not such a big deal, but you want to make sure that they're not on the surface of the piece. However, you can give it a little bit of vibration using a hammer, or just moving a little bit, just doing this little bit of wiggling. You might be wiggling the camera in an annoying way. I can see the bubbles, air bubbles going to the top. There we go. Okay, so a little worried about this liquid maybe weakening the side right down there at the bottom when it's happening. So reinforce that.
good all the way around. So now we just need to be patient and let it set up. So I'll go ahead and clean up my mess. So I'm going to wait for the plaster in the bucket to solidify. If I wipe down the sides, I can get the plaster out of the bucket, out of the sides of the bucket. And while it's really wet, like this, you don't want to ever pour plaster down the sink. So you need to have a drain to dispose of this plaster water. If I put just that little bit of plaster that was on the sponge and dilute it in the water, it won't harden into a clump. So it could be safe to go down the drain with the gray water. Okay, so clean up and take a look at our molds when they're done. Here we are with the plaster now has set up. It's been just about 24 hours. The clay is still very malleable. The patches that I had to make to stop the leaking worked, so the plaster stayed in. You can see as I pull the clay away how there's some plaster residue left behind, and there's little bits of it all over the clay. So that's the main reason why this clay ends up becoming mold making clay. You don't want to use it for your art making. So this is probably one of the more satisfying steps because of all that work, putting it together and taking your time with all those details, and now you just get to take it all away. And it peels right away. Just gonna keep this clay wrapped in plastic so that I can keep it aside for future mold projects. Flip that over. So that's where the shape is on the inside. Might have to dig those out a little bit. So move that one. You can see the shape on the inside of that one. So take a look at these. You can dig out this bit of coil. Because of the organic nature to these shapes, they're possible that they are stuck in there a little bit, and that a little bit of work might need to be done to the plaster itself. Grab a wood tool. I actually got a couple of tools. I have now compressed air and this wood tool. So I'm going to start by using the wood tool to dig out some of the clay, and try to be really careful while I'm doing this process of digging out not to put any nicks into the plaster itself. So just start digging this out. My thought is that if I get it detached, it's pulling away just slightly from the edge right here, and if I get it to pull away like that all the way around, then maybe I can spray some compressed air in there. See if compressed air will help separate it at all. Spraying compressed air, trying to get some right inside of that gap. The way to go about this is to just dig it out. There's a couple other tools to dig it out. A couple root tools.
The metal loop tool would really easily cut into some of this plastic, so I want to be careful. Just dig out clay. Digging away at this and trying to keep my patience. I don't have a rush to get this out. I just want to take my time, keep digging away at it as much as I need to, try not to dig into the clay, the plaster rather, only digging into the clay. There we go. Alright, so shape number 1 is out. Now we go to number 2. Air gets in there and separates it and helps kind of float it. So number 2. Okay, go ahead and clean up this mess. And then the final step for these molds is to shave them down a little bit with the Surform rasp, and we will be ready.